Title for my talk today is New Struggles and Old Conflicts in the Neoliberal Countryside. And some of the conceptual points I want to make are about the question of territories, the question of the state, and fight for legitimacy, and something I have been working during the last time, and it's part of a forthcoming publication, that is this idea of connecting the ideological aspect of social ecological conflicts and the conceptual question of natural resources, something I am trying to understand in terms of the ideology of natural resources use in Chile. So I plan a presentation with 4 parts, and I will use about 35 minutes to present, and then I want to have some questions, discussions, and maybe disagreements, why not? I plan a presentation in which I will first offer an overview of current social ecological conflictivity in Chile using 4 cases, to then make some theoretical and conceptual points, and then to get deeper into the case of forestry and land use in an area of southern Chile, which is my study area, which is called the Ñuble province. And then I will do some concluding remarks. And to offer this overview of what I call here the current social ecological conflictivity in Chile, I will use a little bit the work of Charles Darwin, who, as you know, visited Chile. And in his book about the travel he did in Chile, he mentioned at least 4 places where we can see today how this question of social ecological conflictivity is being developed today. So this is the Bell Mountain in central Chile, close to Santiago. And this one was one of the places where Darwin was doing some research, observing, and taking note for his posterior work. But what interests me here is that when Darwin was in Chile, he was doing a lot of social analysis or making comments about the social reality he witnessed at that time in Chile. So when he was here in the mountain, the Bell Mountain, he wrote something like this: "In the afternoon, we arrived at a cottage at the foot of the Bell Mountain. The inhabitants were freeholders, which is not very usual in Chile. They support themselves on the produce of a garden and a little field, but were very poor. Capital is here so deficient that the people are obliged to sell their green corn while standing in the field in order to buy necessaries for the ensuing year. Wheat, in consequence, was dearer in the very district of its production than in Valparaiso, where the contractors live." So this was one of the Darwin's observations in that area. So today, and I want to bring some more contemporary dynamics in the area, this area is very famous for avocado production, right? I am from this area, so I know the area pretty well. So I grew up in this area. So I grew up among avocados. But today, the avocados that are used are basically a kind of monoculture that is basically thought for export, right? So today, what happens in the area is that avocado plantations have been put in the hills, and they are colonizing more and more areas in this very same area where Darwin was doing this observation. So still, we can see levels of poverty in the area, but a very prosperous avocado sector. So if we continue using Darwin here and following him in his travel, he at some point said that in the whole central area of Chile, the orchards produce an overflowing abundance of peaches, figs, and grapes. With all these advantages, the inhabitants of the country ought to be much more prosperous than they are, right? So another area that Darwin mentioned in his book is Petorca. At some point, Darwin mentioned areas that is not sure if he visited the areas or just hear about what was going on in the area. So Petorca was one of these areas, and this picture I took for 1.5 years ago is in our Petorca. And Darwin observed that people at that time were cutting palms, right? What happens today is that people are planting avocado. And you can see that it's a pretty dry area, but the secret of this commodity of Marx could put it, are water accumulators, right? So when I visit the area and people told me about water accumulators, I was trying to understand what are water accumulators, right? So they brought me there to show me how these plantations are based on the appropriation of water, the accumulation of water, and then the use of water for irrigation, right? But it's not just one, they have many, right? So in the dry area where you see cactus, you have the water accumulators and you have the avocado plantations. So and for activists, this is a new issue, right? So this is an expansion of avocado production toward the north. Therefore, this whole dynamic is still something they are trying to understand well and also fight, right? And here is when the neoliberal project comes into the picture. So this is based on the privatization of water resources. And there are efforts today to change the terms of water use in Chile, but the proposal to change the law has been more than 5 years in the parliament, and it seems that now they are stopping the progress of discussion in the parliament to change the law, which is, as many recognize, one of the most privatized systems for water use of resources. So at the same time, you have water accumulation in one part of the area, and you have these small rivers that have not much water during some seasons, and you have a serious problem of water scarcity, and houses like this need to get water from water trucks that sometimes are delivered by the municipalities, but it's a whole conflict about how water is being distributed in the area. So, and sometimes these new investments, they don't work, like this. This is not avocado, this is another sort of tree, probably a citric tree, so for orange, but they sometimes don't work. So it can have to do with the soil or with the possibilities of irrigation in the area. So this is one example where we can see this thing I'm calling social ecological conflictivity, but we can continue and again take Darwin. Darwin went to the area of Quintero, and he was interested also in the history of Lord Cochrane, who was another British that had an hacienda in Quintero. So, and he visited the area and made some observations, but I will not repeat what Darwin observed at that time. I want to show you that today, in this same area, where actually Lord Cochrane had a house, is an area that for many can be defined as zone of sacrifice, right? An area that historically was decided to be the place for a copper processing mine that actually polluted the whole area. But today, we can see a concentration of new economic activities. We have energy industries here, we have cement industries, and we have this copper processing mill in the area. So this has caused a lot of pollution in the sea, but the copper industry is so important in the area that it has been impossible to do something about the production of copper in the area. Though people have been protesting, there have been a lot of legal action, so still the mill continues working because it's a so important product for Chile, right? So here you see from inside the production of copper, right? And here you see the countryside, which actually was a very important field for agriculture, but because of the pollution coming from the copper production, so was absolutely destroyed. Today there are signs of a recovery, but still the area is very much affected by the historical pattern of copper production in the area. So finally, the other place I wanted to bring to discussion is Chiloé, which was also a place that Darwin visited after arriving to Concepcion. And Chiloé today is famous because of the salmon production in the area, right? So this is a view of what makes Chiloé famous for tourists, but in the waters, and today you cannot see maybe the salmon production in these areas because they have moving it more toward the south, but still this was the area of the epicenter of salmon aquaculture in the country. So Chile became the world's second largest exporter of salmon after Norway, but Norwegian companies went to Chile and invested a lot. So there is a lot of cooperation until today in terms of exchange of technology and capital flows between Norwegian and Chilean companies. Actually, a Chilean salmon producer will have a stock in the Norwegian stock market, as they announced for some weeks ago. So still the area has an artisanal fishery sector that tried to survive. And one of the ways that found to survive was the extraction of algae, right? So algae became a very intensive activity in the last year because there was a new boom of algae extraction in the whole of Chilean coast. And these are the salmon that are arriving to Chiloé, because the hatcheries are not in Chiloé. They are sometimes in the hills, close to Puerto Montt, 200 kilometers from Chiloé. So they transport them to the archipelago, and they use trucks, the ferries, and the salmons go to Chiloé. And here are the salmons going back to the international markets. So this is the airport in Puerto Montt, where actually, so when you take a plane to go to Santiago, you have to wait until all the salmons are also in the plane, right? So you see here what made possible that fresh salmon in some international markets, like for example, New York or other markets, how they can get the fresh salmon, because they fly them and then directly from Santiago, they go to different international markets. So, but to produce salmon today, you also need fields, right? Because after the several salmon crises in Chile, one of the crucial issues became the use of fish oil for salmon production. So one of the ways for the sector to try to confront this and face this problem was to move into vegetable oils, right? So, and this created a boom in terms of rapeseed in the area, right? So, and you can see some of the fields that are now covering some areas close to Chiloé, where previously you had this kind of more traditional plots where you have potatoes, you have animals, and you have some forests, right? And you have these mills, right, that are processing the wraps or the other vegetables to produce the input for salmon production, right? So you have an important change that has to do with salmon, but at the same time, it's a social change because some of these producers, for example, potato producers, are moving into the salmon sector indirectly because they are producing these seeds, right? And one told me that before they produced potatoes, according to his view, potatoes were food for the people. And he said, now I'm producing food for the salmon. Maybe people eat the salmon, he say, but it's not the same because, but I am in this business because it's growing, it's quite good, right? So my final comment about this area has to do with the interlinks between, this local process, but also the international processes, right? So I mentioned one that has to do with international markets and the circulation of these commodities, but for many of these production processes to take place, you need a lot of technology, and many times this technology is not produced in Chile, but is imported. So you have Swedish Husqvarna in the area, you have all these international companies operating there, so BAF, Anasac, DuPont, and you have these other companies that are providing the technology that is needed for these economic processes that are social ecological processes associated with social ecological conflictivity. In Chiloé, in Puchuncaví, in Petorca, and in many other areas in Chile, today there are growing conflicts concerning how people are trying to face these production processes, how people are trying to remake the terms of the interaction between the communities and these companies. And in some cases, like in Chiloé, we have had massive protests because of environmental disaster that sometimes are directly associated with salmon or sometimes are indirectly associated with salmon, but still people are protesting more and more. There are maps about conflicts in Chile that show that everywhere you will find a kind of conflict, right? But still, I think that we have to make a more deeper understanding of this kind of conflicts. So first, and bringing some very basic theoretical point, this has to do with neoliberalism, right? So everyone knows that Chile is regarded as the neoliberal laboratory, so it became even more obvious when Harry published his book on neoliberalism. But as a matter of fact, when we think about neoliberalism in Chile, we have to actually think in terms of plantations. Actually, one of the first important steps of the dictatorship in order to offer a kind of new development pattern was the decree law that was passed in 1974. I will mention more about that. But that had to do with the tree plantation. And the other economic sectors are grapes, you can have avocado here, fruit for international markets. And later, the salmon sector became one of these pillars of the neoliberal project in Chile. And of course, always we have had copper that was important, of course, before the dictatorship, and it continued being important, but the difference is that today is a sector mainly driven by private interests. With the opening of the market, the opening to international foreign investments, Chile became and continue being a very important export producer and exporter, but with more and more participation of private companies. So this year is the anniversary of the agrarian reform, or we would say the second law for the agrarian reform in Chile. So there were many attempts before the Frey government to have agrarian reform in Chile, but people regard this as the very important step into agrarian reform. So I will keep this idea of the agrarian reform for the concluding remarks, right? So if we try to make a link between the dictatorship and what is called the transition period in Chile concerning the issue of agriculture, I think that there is an understanding that can be very useful, and it was developed by David Hodgman, and others made the same kind of analysis at that time when the transition into democracy, or so-called democracy, started in Chile, and people working in agrarian issues, many people with a focus on the result of the agrarian reform, trying to understand what would happen in Chile at that time. So this author said that a lucid creative combination of continuity and change was the only guarantee of success for the old policies, for those of future, and for those of future democratic administrations. And these are my emphasis. Continuity and legitimacy are the fundamental pillars for democratic agriculture development, right? So this shows that actually for agrarian issues, so the new government tried to preserve the basic structures, right? So the economy was open, so it was growing, so exports growing, so incomes coming into the country. But the issue for them was very much about how to engage people and create a sort of neoliberalism with a human face or something like that, right? So, but today we see how this project of continuity, change, and legitimacy is collapsing. And it's collapsing because of what we see everywhere in Chile that we can understand as social ecological conflictivity. So my point here is that sometimes we tend to see conflicts in Chile as different expression of particular problems. But for me, what really defines Chile today is this social ecological conflictivity that you see everywhere. And when you see this expression of struggles in Chile, in Petorca, and in other parts, you're actually seeing the expression of this very deep social ecological conflictivity. And therefore, the question of territories became so important, because the territories where this social ecological conflictivity explodes are very much result of partly this investment, but partly the effort of activists and people opposing them, right? So they are producing these territories of struggle. And here is where we can think the state in better terms, because the state tried to define these territories, and at the same time, it faces these issues of legitimacy, and we have this question of how people are fighting to establish certain legitimacy criteria, right? I don't think that legitimacy can be something that we can just define and say, well, we obtain something like such a thing that is legitimacy, right? So I think that we always have different legitimacy ideas, or ideas about what is illegitimate, and there we have this struggle to impose certain terms and create this process of legitimization. And actually, this was one of the main issues that came up in the recent mobilizations in Chile, that many observers tended to see as a crisis of legitimacy of the whole system, right? But still, I think that the question is more problematic. And it has to do with the question of the natural resources. Even if you see how this legitimacy of the system is being contested, you can see at the same time that it seems to be an agreement in Chile that we have so many natural resources, right? And the question is how we use those resources. And the question is not if we are going to question the very fact of defining ecological system, ecologies, and local areas as natural resources or not, but the question is how to use them, right? And then you have all the discursivity about sustainable development or sustainability, resilience, and all those new conceptual devices that sometimes even people in the resistance to this model tend to use, right? So I am trying to understand this as a kind of ideology, right? An ideology that has been a pattern in Chile, an historical pattern that says that Chile has natural resources that should be used, and then you combine this with the discursivity of comparative advantages, right? Because the neoliberal model in Chile, at the end of the day, is a model of comparative advantages, right? So it has not changed that, and it's repeated and repeated. Now, even in progressive movements, the main problem is how to get more value added for the products, right? So you can struggle to control, for example, the expansion of salmon and put more ecological or environmental limits, if you want to think that way, but it's not much about questioning the very fact that Chile is depleting many resources or ecological system to produce these salmons. The question is to continue thinking that we have these resources to be used, right? So this kind of conceptual and theoretical points, I think, can be observed in a deeper way if we now take one of these cases for the discussion. And here I will refer to my PhD, and I will, at some point, as I say, make some connection to the Swedish case. Because one of the points I make in my PhD is about the issue of world forestry, right? Forestry today, at least the forestry we have in Chile, the use of tree plantation, is very much a global project. So it's not a project that just happened. It was actually discussed in the FAO system, and there was an author there that coined the term world forestry, right? Just one word, like world forestry. And the concept actually developed in the context where Chile and other countries were becoming more and more important, first in discursive terms, and second in material terms, for the development of world forestry. Meaning that people in the north realized that production of forest resources were moving south, and therefore it was important to focus on the development of forestry in those countries. And the very important factors were two: labor and ecology, because the rotation period of pine and eucalyptus, that are the most used trees for plantation in Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and other countries in South America and in other countries too, are much shorter than the rotation period of even plantations in the north, right? So the study area that I will refer to is about 5 hours from Santiago. It's called the Ñuble area, and it's one of the epicenters of forestry development today. I will explain why. This is not the Mapuche area, so of course there are some connections, but this is toward the north of what we call Araucanía, or the areas that Mapuche people reclaim as their lands, right? So this is an area characterized by the mountain range that at some point still have important trees and forests that people regard as native forests, but at other points it has a combination of plantations and native forests, right? So this is one of the new dynamics of forestry in Chile that are getting higher and higher in the Andes, right? So, and even in part where you say, well, there are a lot of so-called native forests here, you can see some patches of plantations here. So then in the valley, you have a lot of agriculture, but then when you go toward the coast, you will find a drier area that is defined as an area for forestry, defined in the law, defined in the policy, defined in the minds of people, that you cannot do other things here, right? It was eroded by other production systems, and today it's a perfect place for eucalyptus now, and in the past was more for pines. And peasants, we will not get into discussion if he's a peasant or a farmer, but peasants in this area are making choices today, right? They are making choices regarding how to use their land. This guy, for example, told me that he likes agriculture. He feels like he's a peasant, but at the same time, he sees the expansion of the plantation. But he did something very important and something that some people in Chile are not thinking about. He didn't change completely into forestry. He planted some hectares of his plot and keep others for agriculture and for animal husbandry, right? He's making these kind of options. At the same time, in other areas, you see the competition between pines and wine. We can say that because this is these vineyards for wine production. This is not wine for export, but it's very appreciated in the local area. They call the wine that they produce like the Chilean wine, and you buy 5 little bottles of wine, but still these kind of activities are disappearing, right? I was told that maybe next time I am there, so the tree plantation will cover this area. And this is agriculture area, right? And as they are private lands, so even if people don't take the subsidies that you can take for planting, it still can be profitable because you will have probably good water resources and you will have the possibility to have a plantation here. So the plantation system is organized basically through wage labor in the plantation, right? This is one of the workers that participated in the 2007 strike that actually ended with the killing of a worker outside a pulp mill. But this was one of the largest strikes in Chile, and it's very important because it organized workers subcontracted, working with contractors, and also brought together forestry workers, the truck drivers, and other workers. So one of the strategies they used was to stop the whole production system, right? And because of the increasing level of conflictivity in the same struggle, and unfortunately the fact that a worker died, so they forced the companies to sign agreements with them, right? So they bypass or force the subcontractors to improve the working conditions. But it's very contested because, for example, when I was there, they were still complaining about that agreement because the companies can control so many parts of the process, right? They cut the eucalyptus, so they deliver to the trucks, but then they get bonuses that are defined according to how much good are they delivering to the pulp mills, so, right? So they don't have the control to really, define the amount of good that they are producing. So that is one matter of concern for them. And also they got a better lunch from the companies, but still they get 2 sandwiches, right? So it's not enough. So they still need to use part of their salaries to get, the dairy, the everyday lunch they need, right? So other dynamics of forestry in the area have to do with this kind of parcels, where people still, as the other peasant does, still keep agriculture here, but they try eucalyptus in the hills, right? But these are people outside the main system, right? They are not getting subsidies. They are doing it basically because there is today the incentive for timber production. So, as I said earlier, one of the reasons that this area became one of the epicenters of forestry and one of the most developed areas for forestry projects is that a new pulp mill arrived to the area, right? A huge pulp mill that at some point can produce more than 1 million tons of pulp. And it's a pulp mill that is not only for pulp production, it's a forestry complex, right? And the process of getting this there was very contested, with a lot of legal actions in the court in Chile. Actually, an important Supreme Court decision is part of the approval of the pulp mill, which again shows one of the dimensions of the state that sometimes missing the discussion. So I would say that here in this case, we can see how the state is part of this project by having this established system of subsidies, fomenting forestry very much, but at some point, so other processes within the state, namely the Supreme Court decision, are part of the conflictivity here too, right? And this is important because sometimes when we discuss the state, we miss an important point that has to do with the way we understand the state in Chile, that has to do with the executive power, the legislative power, and the judicial power, right? So because of the contestation around this project and the question of the environmental impact assessment has grown in Chile, so people tend sometimes to go to the courts, right? And sometimes courts stop projects. Sometimes there are processes within the government, as one that took place recently, that means that some projects are stopped, right? It doesn't mean that the whole state is now changing mind, but it means that people still are able to work within the limit of the state to get some results. So this is the pipeline of that pulp mill that was part of a second environmental impact assessment and caused a lot of contestation in the area. And in the area, we also have a biosphere reserve that is very contested too, because there are already some plantations within the reserve, and people discuss that very much. And in the area, we also have the use of native forests by other labor arrangements, right? There are sharecroppers working with a forest expert in order to get actually a forest management plan. But this is not their land because they are sharecroppers. Those are the landowner that allowed them to work here, even work with the technician to get the authorization to use the land. And then they share the incomes 50 and 50, or depending on how you negotiate the terms with the landowner. So we have a very developed sector, and still we have this other that I don't call undeveloped, but I call an alternative system of forest use and land use, right? But still, the area has seen a dramatic land use change, right? In the inventory of resources in the area that came up in 2008, this shown that between 1998 and 2008, there were about 56,000 less hectares of agricultural land, right? Whereas the area of tree plantation increased in 115,000 about, right? So, and still there was less native forest, something that shouldn't happen because we have on paper better laws that protect the native forest, but still it's not happening as before, but it happens, right? So this increase actually gave place to what in the local area was defined as a forestry revolution, right? So you can read the newspaper from the local area and people were saying, now we are in a new step in the development of forestry. This is bringing development. This is bringing better living conditions. But still, when you see the statistics, you can discuss that very much, because there are studies that show that actually in areas and municipalities where you have expansion of tree plantations, you have not diminished, no less poverty, but sometimes even you have increasing poverty, right? So here, and to make sense of this, I wanted to quote a long thing that I reproduced in my thesis, and it has to do with the origins of the decree law that regulates very much the forestry sector in Chile, right? This was actually a letter that was sent to the dictatorship because they still work with legislative processes. So they had commissions, so they discussed things, right? So they were a group of people that had all the power, but for some issues they needed to have some procedures, right? So when they were discussing the approach they wanted to have concerning forestry, they got a letter, right, from a representative of forest industries in Chile. And the letter is part of the documents that are today known as the Decree Law 701, right? That established or reestablished or improved, maybe is a better term, the system of subsidies, right? And here I want to read, because it says something very important. They say to the militaries, right? Our association has constantly insisted to all the governments, and in different ways, that it's urgent to have a plan for intensive reforestation. At some point, they use the word to create forests, right? To produce forests, right? However, and so we have been heard many times, and representatives from those governments express agreement with us and announce plans in this regard, the fact is that unfortunately everything remains as only plans and projects, and never has been decided to take the necessary measures. And they were right. I mean, other governments say that they wanted forestry development for Chile. It was not the main important focus of the agrarian reform, but still there are some reports showing that the different governments that engaged in the agrarian reform wanted forestry as an important economic activity, and pork production was very much a state-run activity because they had the idea of using the forest resources from Chile. We can make here a complementary point. So to make Chile this important producer of forest, though these representatives from the landed class are complaining, so Chile needed some expertise, and some important expertise came from the United States. For example, this is a famous report that was used in the context of discussing forestry in Chile. It's the High Commission that went to Chile and produced this report in 1946 and mapped incredibly well all the potential of Chile to produce forest resources. But at some point, it says that, and this is the important thing for the issue of comparative advantages, it says that Chile had, at that time, and it was in a very important position to profit from the post-war contraction demands for good and good products of alkenes, right? So they insisted that Chile had the potential to increase the use of forests for the domestic market, but at the same time, they opened the door for export of resources from Chile to the international market. And this actually takes place at the same time where people were talking about world forestry or seeing the whole world in terms of forestry development as one integrated kind of system, right? So, but this landed organization continued. And he's talking about his personal view, but representing this organization. I'm sure that our current government will not frustrate these legitimate expectations and will not sentence Chile to the mediocrity as a forestry power in Latin America, as a country that has been a leader in this regard in forestry. We are the continent's largest exporter of newsprint and wood pulp, and the short term, other countries will win us because they have been wise and have put in practice the measures we have formulated and presented both here and abroad, right? And they continue. And they have applied such ideas in a visionary way. They have increased and created wealth through larger and larger plantations. And in this way, they have moved capitals towards the forest. This by nature goes in the benefit of the future generation and the future of the companies of the country, which life of the companies they are talking about is not limited as the life of the human beings. It is the time that in this new Chile, where we all have justified expectations, this bad situation is radically changed. And it changed, right? So they got what they wanted. So they got this decree law that started to subsidize in a more aggressive way plantations. And many of the big companies benefit from this system. But if we go back to the area of Ñuble, as it looks like today, we can see this very clear separation between the industrial sector and what we can maybe refer as the artisanal sector. An artisanal sector that uses the native forest that then is used for firewood and charcoal, which is a very important source of energy in the area, right? For heating, for cooking, for many other human needs. Whereas the plantation system, based on wage labor, transport, and the organization of all this system around this forestry project is mainly for export, right? So back to this peasant. So he's always in the situation of delivering his produce to the companies or to the local market. And it's very unclear. Sometimes the market is good for them. For example, I was there when it was very good. Sometimes very bad. So it's an important decision, but people sometimes don't know what will happen. But the colonization of these exotic species is a real problem too. Like for example, in this area where you have a clear plantation, but you have the native forest, still if you go closer, look closer to this native forest, you will find some pines anyway, because they are expanding. So they are expanding, and this is a very serious concern for ecologists. So as I explained, the pines can get into the areas where there are native forests, and these are invasive species too. So the plantation system even expand to areas that are not properly planted with tree species as pine and eucalyptus. But in order to understand this plantation system and to understand both the work of companies and also of small owners that are today engaging in pine and eucalyptus plantations, we can have a look at how it starts in terms of the practices that are implied in the plantation system. And here we have three nurseries, where in one case we have a large nursery, is owned by a company, but on the other side we have a private person that does this in his yard, and it has here almost 10,000 plants that then he will sell to local small landowners that can start planting them. So, and if we try to understand how it works in some specific cases, we can, for example, have a look to this owner that actually owns about 2 hectares of land in a hilly area, and then he is trying eucalyptus. But one of the things that he told me is that actually he's having already problems with water, and he can see the connection between having this eucalyptus here and the water sources he has in the same hill. But what I want to highlight here is that he explained to me that one of the reasons for him to try eucalyptus in this case is that along his land there is a large plantation, and it's an eucalyptus plantation, and because of that he also wanted to try and see the economic possibilities of having eucalyptus in his parcel. So all these activities have created a quite massive agrarian transformation in the area, as I explained earlier. So there is a clear pattern of land use change in which we can see that agriculture is losing importance in the area, and tree planting is becoming a sort of hegemonic productive activity for the area. And this is represented in many ways. But for example, in one case, we can see here how a local municipality is represented in his anthem, and the symbol of the municipality is a wheat, because the area used to be an area where wheat production was very important. But today, according to interviews there, so they say that maybe they should change this, and instead of having wheat, to have pine or eucalyptus. So it represents the scale of the change at the symbolic level too. So we can also see the kind of dynamics imply in the expansion of forestry and how people perceive this when we look at the environmental impact assessments of the pulp mill in the area. I took 2 environmental impact assessments, and one is from 2000, another from 2006. One is for the the industry in itself, and the second is for the pipeline that was planned to discharge the sewage into the sea. And what I want to highlight here is one thing, and it is that in the first case, one of the priorities for the people that participated in the public consultation process was to express concerns about agriculture in the area. And this can be explained because the forestry complex was associated with forestry first, and it implies plantations. So people were expressing their concerns of the agriculture characteristics of the area in relation to forestry. And then in the second impact assessment, when the issue of the pipeline was discussed, one of the main concerns of the people were the marine resources in the area where the pipeline was planned to discharge the sewage. And again, this can be explained because of the importance of the marine resources for the people along the coast. So one reflection we can make here is that when we have these environmental impact assessments and people participate in the public consultation, of course, there is a tendency for people to try to protect or express concerns about the local resources or the resources that are closer to their livelihoods. And we can make a more general comment about environmental impact assessment associated with this project in Chile. And one is that they have been very much criticized by NGOs, local communities, and we can think that the problem with them is basically a problem of legitimization. So there has been a process of delimitation of the environmental impact assessment. And actually, in this analysis, I also highlight that when participating in the environmental impact assessment, the local inhabitants actually express concerns about the process of environmental impact assessment in itself. So there is a critique of these processes. And I use the word legitimacy or delegitimization. And I want to, for example, show here that one aspect of the impact assessment is that the company offer compensations, and one way to work with compensation is to cooperate with municipalities at the local level. So here we see a mobile library in this car, in where actually it's very difficult to distinguish if this library is owned by the company, because it has the name of the company in there, and also it has the name of the municipality. So the fact that these companies can use all their economic power at the local level is very much seen in this case. And it also creates a lot of critiques, because what we can see here is that the interests of the company are actually overlapping with the activities of the municipality. So, and this is also a way for these communities, for these companies to penetrate into the local areas. And actually, as they offer something that for many should be offered by the state or by other actors, but not the companies that are actually trying to protect their own interests, and in this case, the development of forestry, and to be more specific, of capitalist forestry. So that aspect is important, and I think that we can also highlight here that in combination with all these problematic dynamics of forestry in the area, the issue of climate change has also become a kind of problem. And one of the problems has to do with the fact that in the area there are plantation projects that are today framed in terms of climate change adaptation or mitigation, and in more specific terms, they are being used for carbon credits. So this is one example of a tree plantation that is proposed for the objective of producing carbon credits. And in this case, when I did fieldwork in the area, I observed a meeting between experts and landowners, or small landowners and medium landowners too, that are being told about the possibilities to get extra incomes by being part of carbon trade. We can observe here that these owners are exposed to information coming from experts, and this is information about climate change, but this is information that is instrumentally transformed into the possibility to obtain new source of incomes from the carbon trade system. And actually, one observation I did here was that for an important number of these participants in this meeting, the issue of climate change was completely unclear, and the main concern that they had was to try to understand how they can really fit into a carbon trade scheme and the activity they do when they plant trees. So that is one additional component of what is going on in the area in terms of forestry, politics, and in particularly in the last case, the arrival of climate change concern into the area. But we have to understand this in the larger context of Chilean politics. To understand forestry today in Chile, we have to consider that for the different governments and therefore for the Chilean state, forestry is a key part of their agrarian policy. It has been framed actually as a new policy for the country, and the policy is understood in terms of Chile, a food and forestry power. And here, what the main purpose of this policy is to reinforce certain economic activities as forestry, with the goal of increasing participation in the international market and consolidating Chile's position in the global trade of food and forest products. So the state has had this approach, and in the case of forestry recently, has the efforts have been into modifying certain aspects of the forestry legislation, trying to create a new framework for forestry in the country, and this has been partially a result of the critique against this model. So one of the critiques, for example, has been proposed by organizations as, for example, the Association of Foresters for the Native Forest, that has identified a number of problems with Chile's forestry approach based on plantations. So recently, a new forestry plan was approved, and now one of the main focus with that new approach is to engage small owners into forestry activities. But that is also the approach of companies today. As this example shows, some companies, and large forestry companies, to be more specific, are approaching the small owners in order to get their participation into forestry and this is, for example, manifested in agreements of clean production that implied cooperation between large companies and small owners. And obviously, the objective here is that the small owners can become suppliers of forest resources for the big companies. And in this way, we can observe that there is an expansion of forestry based on pine and eucalyptus plantations. And again, this process of expansion is very much dominated by the interests of the big companies. But besides the historical critique of forestry in Chile, based on the environmental consequences of plantations, based on the inequalities of the system, based on the level of poverty in these areas of forestry development, we have now a new issue, and that is the issue of the forest fires in the country. In the area, for example, in 2012, there was a large forest fire that was even considered a mega forest fire, and thousands of hectares of land were affected and devastated by this forest fire. And even the forestry complex in the area was affected by the forest fire, as this picture shows. So when I mentioned the question of inequality, I think that we can try to visualize this by, well, having this very developed forestry complex with a lot of very modern technology, and very expensive technology, and with technology that has been imported to the country, technology that is coming from countries as Sweden, Finland, and other large providers of forestry technology for the country. And therefore, I say that here we have a lot of wealth in terms of this technology. But on the other hand, we have the people living in the area that are still living in poverty conditions, as is represented by this small house, also affected by the forest fire. So within this context, I think we can try to also see what can be some alternatives, or how people are trying to develop some alternatives. And I will just mention one example that for me is one of the most interesting cases, and is the agroecological movement. The agroecological movement in the area is actually trying to rethink the agrarian processes in the area, and trying to confront the discourse that says that in these areas land should be basically used for forestry, and forestry that means tree plantations and eucalyptus and pines, to be more specific. So what the agroecological movement in the area does is to use agroecological practices to show that still the area can produce food. And in this case, what we actually see is a kind of agroforestry system where even some eucalyptus are used as part of a farm model that try to also show that if you have some eucalyptus well located and not in a very large scale model, so you can combine food production and these trees in the same land. So this experience with agroecology also try to show how very simple technologies can be used by small owners, small landowners in the area, and the peasants that can learn also in this side of agroecological experimentation. So to finish, I would like to just write some points for the discussion, and to think how this social ecological conflictivity can be seen as a land and agrarian question in Chile, having in mind that Chile, some Chileans this year celebrated the 50th anniversary of the agrarian reform. When I say some Chileans, of course, I am trying to say that this is still a very contested issue. So there were sectors in the Chilean population that were still until today questioning the agrarian reform, whereas others were highlighting the agrarian reform in Chile as one of the most important political events in the history of Chile, something that is also my view, though we have to also look at the agrarian reform with a larger perspective and also see what were the effects of that, and also how was the process of challenging the agrarian reform during the dictatorship, but we don't have much time to do that here. So I want to just say that this land and agrarian question in Chile today, and in particular in this area, can be seen as a conflict between territories of plantations versus territories of agriculture and other forests. So we're talking about here about a very basic question, thinking in the term of the agrarian reform that Phil McMichael has proposed recently, as a question about who shall use the land and to which social ecological ends, right? So the question of plantations, agriculture, and the use of native forests is very much about that. It has to do with property rights, it has to do with the use of property rights, and it has to do with the social ecological outcomes of having tree plantations or agriculture or preserving the native forests. And we can also add that it has to do with who decide what to do with the land in these areas. And for this, we need to consider the state interventions in relation to plantations, and also how forestry and pulp production developed in a capitalistic way are today one of the main components of the Chilean agrarian policy and approach towards local areas in this particular geographical context. So there is also an issue here with the legitimacy and the struggles for legitimacy around forestry and the development of capitalist forestry. So legitimation struggles are very much today about the critique of the forestry sector, and also the efforts by the state and by companies of trying to gain or impose a meaning of legitimacy for this kind of development. And finally, and I am bringing here a kind of notion I would like to develop further, and that is the question of a sort of ideology of natural resource use in Chile, and how there is a kind of persistence in the belief that because of Chile have plenty of natural resources, they should be used, and in this context, most of the time, the focus with this thinking about using what is understood as natural resources has to do with export, or the idea of comparative advantages still working as a very important ideological component in the way Chile develops. So the ideology of natural resources use is a way to try to understand how the much more political question about the use of land is sometimes reframed in terms of the need to use the natural resources in the country for export, or in some cases for domestic consumption, but still keeping this idea of Chile having plenty of natural resources that should be used. So the very basic point here is that I don't think there is something we can call natural resources in these cases. What we have here are lands, are labor relations, are structures and subjectivities that are in the local area in constant conflict, and there are ongoing struggles about how are people going to use the land in these areas. So to think in terms of the ideology of natural resources is also a way to identify what are the continuities between different political projects that try to propose new policies in the country. And in some cases, we can identify that actually there is a continuity between different political periods in where Chile has been seen as so in a way a naturally oriented country for the export of natural resources. So these are open questions that I think will be part of the political discussion in the country for the next years, and there are still many discussions about this. With that, I am closing. Thank you.